Whew. So, let's finish with the man, the myth, the legend, Kraut. One of my favorite YouTubers, to be honest. And we're going to watch his video on the origin of Russian authoritarianism. Hell yeah.
Before we get into this video, I would like to inform you that this video is sponsored by Keeps. Keeps is a men's health subscription service that provides men with wide-ranging services and products to prevent hair loss. 2 out of 3 men suffer from hair loss, and the best way to combat it is to do something about it.
2 out of 3 men? Really? I mean, what do you guys think? Am I losing? I'm losing a little bit of hair, but I don't think it's that bad. I think I overall have, some good hairline.
While you still have hair. With Keeps, a licensed doctor will review your information online and build a treatment plan for you. Your shipments of treatment products will then be sent to you every 3 months. Your doctor will also be available for you via chat 24 hours a day for 7 days a week. The reviews of their products and services are widely positive, and you can check them as well as the before and after reports out yourself, if you wish to convince yourself of their products and services first. Prevention is key to preventing hair loss, and if you're ready to take action and prevent hair loss yourself, you can go to keeps.com/Kraut or click the link in the description to receive 50% off your first order. That's keeps.com/Kraut. Many thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into it. Nomadic empires were some of the most fascinating entities in human history. Originating from the steppes of Central Asia, most lived in isolation, unbothered by neighboring empires who saw their lands as worthless. This isolation allowed many nomadic tribes to specialize increasingly in nomadic life and warfare, competing with other tribes in a continuous struggle that, in a survival of the fittest way, resulted in ever-proficient.
Gosh, I'm just so fucking excited about Kraut.
They ventured forth from their steppes to overrun and conquer settled societies
the Romans,
that were ill-prepared to face them.
The Romans,
However, as
dude.
efficient and near unbeatable as these nomadic peoples were in
Mongols and China.
a curious thing about them was that once they settled in the lands they had conquered, the nomads turned into what they had conquered. The Magyar tribes conquered Pannonia.
And he said why the Mongol Empire split? Because, the people who would conquer certain bits of land, they would adapt. And they would adopt the cultures of the lands conquered.
The Hungarian kingdom. The Slavic tribes conquered Eastern Europe and turned into the Slavic kingdoms. The Seljuk Turks conquered Iran and became the new Iranian Empire. The Ottoman Turks conquered Anatolia and became the new Romans. The Chagatai Turks conquered India and became the Indians. The Mongols conquered Iran and became the new Iranian Empire. And when the Mongols conquered China, they became the new Chinese Empire. There is, however, one big
Who's that Pokemon? The Kievan Rus?
By nomadic peoples and their consequent social restructuring. Russia. Medieval Russia was not that much different from many other medieval European states at the time, a collection of small duchies, cities and dukedoms with no centralized overarching authority. The most prominent among these were the Kievan Rus and the Novgorod Republic. The Kievan Rus was a princely state with deep cultural and commercial ties into Europe, mainly through the Byzantines. The Novgorod Republic was a city-state and an important part of the Hanseatic League of cities that stretched across the Baltic and North Sea. Then came the Mongols.
Ooh, the Golden Horde.
There's a tendency amongst modern historians to paint the Mongol Empire in a positive light as an institution of trade and tolerance, which, though, is very oversimplified and overlooks the fact that the Mongol Empire was an extractive institution. The Mongols were a tribal people who had no state or legal structures that they transferred over to the people they conquered. Their relation with those they conquered was purely predatory. They wanted to extract wealth and resources from them, and those who refused paid dearly. The Kievan Rus was one of these places that resisted. Kiev was burnt to the ground and the surrounding lands pillaged, with much of the population slaughtered. Medieval accounts tell us of fields filled with human remains for decades after the siege. With the burning of Kiev, substantial political
Could you react to the origins of the Huns by kings and generals later?
Russia began. The
Yeah, we could do
Clever Rus,
that.
with its deep cultural and economic ties to the Byzantians,
Maybe
had
for
been
a
the
next
cultural
stream, what do you
motherland
think?
and
I think
birthplace
2
of
hours is
Russia,
already a
the
little
place
long.
where Russia as a European cultural entity had been created. All that was left of it now was ash. The cultural and economic ties with the Byzantians were now broken. This resulted in a geopolitical shift of Russia.
Kievan Rus would face the
culturally and
worst when the
politically in
Mongols
power
came.
to the northeast. The Mongols enforced their economic order upon the remaining Russian principality states, and the center of Russian political and economic power consequently shifted to the landlocked plains of Smolensk, Rostov, and Chernikov. These places and the princes who ruled them had been largely ignored backwaters before the Mongols. Now they stood at the center of Russia. Throughout the rest of Europe, the institution of feudalism had during this time started to be increasingly challenged. New political and commercial institutions evolved in European trade cities, from Antwerp to Hamburg to Königsberg, Warsaw, Paris, Lisbon, London, and Venice. Merchants, barons, and artisan guilds rewrote the feudal social contract. Additionally, the Black Plague shook up the economic framework of Europe dramatically. With a third of Europe's population killed, there were no longer enough peasants to work the lands for lords. Landlords consequently started competing for the remaining peasants by offering them payment for work. Previously, peasants had worked in exchange for a
free.
promise of protection. That now became increasingly replaced by a wage-based labor system.
And
But
money.
Russia remained untouched by these political and economic developments. It remained under Mongol rule for 250 years and went into an entirely different direction. The princes of Central Russia were recruited by the Mongol.
The Mongols were probably the most efficient killers before industrialization,
tax
maybe even
collectors.
including the
Mongols
industrial age.
outsourced the
They
process
were-
of
yeah.
extracting the resources they wanted.
They were
out of
very
the Russian
effective.
peasantry to the Russian princes. Because that aristocracy had a lot to lose if they failed to appease their Mongol overlords, and because the Mongols had brought no legal code of limited aristocratic power, the Russian princes extracted that wealth with increasing unopposed ruthlessness and brutality. While in Europe, feudalism increasingly disbanded, an increasingly exploitative economic framework was reinforced in Russia. Urbanization didn't take place as it did in Europe, with the Russian princes invested in keeping as many peasants working the lands as possible. The Russian princes recruited armies of cavalrymen who were paid not in money, but in land, and the peasants on it. However, because there was so much land, control of the
damn.
land was not
Bro, imagine being a peasant and they just using you as bargaining chips. It must been pretty rough for the peasants in Russia. And I remember some of the history from like early World War II that Russia still used some of those systems. Like it was still kind of feudal. Kind of throwing of corpses infected with bubonic plague by the Mongols called chemical warfare.
not as important as control
Probably.
of people. While in Europe, peasants
And I
gained
would say,
access
yeah,
to
absolutely.
wages and left for cities to escape feudal lords. In Russia, the peasants became deeper tied into their land, through
yep.
strict rules tying them to it, debt patronage, and brutal punishments for attempting to flee. The Black Plague had the opposite socio-economic outcome in Russia compared to Europe. While in Europe, lords started competing for peasants by paying them wages,
Cash.
the Russian princes used the plague to tie lands into enormous duchies and fiefdoms under a smaller number of lords, creating an enormous peasantry working the lands of an extremely small aristocracy. When nomads conquered a settled people, they usually turned into who they conquered. But here, in a weird twist, the conquered Russians almost became Mongols. They were unshackled
Almost.
from any and all political accountability to their peasantry and could rule like the conquerors whom they served. But because the Russian princes merely served the Mongols and were not Mongols themselves, they didn't adopt the tribal customs and nomadic lifestyle of them. The power structure of the Russian princely states thereby became
Russia
heavily
doubled down
centralized
of
within
serfdom
the
around
power of
time
a
Western
single
Europe was getting
ruler
rid of it.
figure of a state. The Russian princes even adopted the warfare tactics of their conquerors. Rather than build stone
To
castles
think they
as the
fought
rest of
and
Europe
beat
did,
it,
they built
armies from
wooden
Poland and
fortresses
Hungary all the way
recruited
to
large
China,
cavalry
Korea,
armies.
Persia.
When
It's
they were
insane.
invaded, they burnt the wooden castles down, ransacked and burnt the fields of their own land, and then harassed invaders from horseback, while those invaders were forced to march through and suffer the vastness of Russia. The Russians also missed out on a key development in European political development at the time. where a move away from decentralized feudalism into centralized absolutist kingdoms took place, creating the first large and powerful centralized European states. Over the 250 years of Mongol rule, with the shift from Kiev and Novgorod to central Russia and an economic development away from commerce and artisans to a peasant economy, the most powerful Russian princely state to emerge was the Duchy of Moscow, which would eventually be the one to rise up in rebellion and kick the Mongols out to create a new Russian state centered around Moscow. But with the Mongols gone, the
Muscovy.
independent Russia kept the socio-economic and political structures that had
That's
developed
dope.
under Mongol rule and strengthened them. Absolutism is a system of governments in which all political power lies within one singular ruler. Beginning in the 1500s, many a European monarchy embarked on
Spain,
efforts
Austria,
to construct
UK.
absolutist states, most famously France. It is during this time that the foundations of the modern nation-state were laid, but the absolutism project in general was rather unsuccessful. The French monarchs drove the state into bankruptcy and ended up selling government offices and thereby state power to the highest bidders. The Stuart dynasty attempts to build absolutism in Britain ended with their expulsion. Throughout Europe, urban populations, lower gentry, and merchants had made the establishment of the all-powerful state difficult. But the conditions found in Russia allowed the Russian Tsars to create a near-perfect absolutism. There are three main factors that led to this.
So wow, it's funny. It's not really funny, but it's interesting to know how Mongol rule really affected Russia and made it what it is today. Or maybe not made it, but definitely helped shape what we know as Russia, because the rest of Europe wasn't conquered by the Mongols, or probably they were influenced by the Mongols, but they were untouched by their conquest. So it definitely affects.
First, Russian society after Mongol rule consisted of a monarch, the army the monarch paid with land, an aristocracy of boyars, and a peasantry. A key difference to other parts
Sounds
of Europe
very
was that
feudal.
the army was not incorporated within the aristocratic class. The army had been directly recruited by the Muscovite state and was dependent upon that state for its status and pay. The state, and thereby the monarch, could use the army without constraints by any aristocrats, even against those aristocrats. Second, Russia didn't experience the regionalized feudal social structures that the rest of Europe did. In fact, there is debate among historians if Russia experienced medieval feudalism at all. Medieval feudalism was a social system in which a peasantry submitted to a military
the Soviet
and his castle
Russian
in
song.
exchange for protection. In Russia, though, the regionalized structure of aristocracy didn't exist. There were no castles offering protection in these vast lands, and military power lay with the state. The new Muscovite state also introduced the mestinestvo, a system of hierarchies amongst lesser nobles that pitted them up against each other in competition for the favor of the monarch. In Europe, the lower aristocracy had an important role in the creation of parliamentary structures by forming a political bloc, competing with the king for concessions, privileges, rights, and powers. In Russia, all power remained with the monarch.
With the
The
king,
aristocracy
yeah.
was set up to compete with
The
each
Russian
other
Tsar.
for the favor of the monarch. Third, law developed differently in Russia to the rest of Europe. One of the key factors in the development of law in Europe had been the Catholic Church. It established almost state-like structures that competed with monarchs for authority, creating standards for accountability that evolved into written codes of law. Kings of Europe could not just do as they pleased to their subjects or their aristocracy. Violating the standards set by the Catholic Church resulted in harsh condemnation.
Russia was
and
part of the
punishment by the
Orthodox
Church. Medieval
world.
feudalism was not a mere exploitative social
Russia
framework.
turned
It was a
tables on
religious
Mongolia
social
because they
order
were
under which
occupied during
systems
most
of
of the
accountability
20th
were
century.
created by religion that
Yeah.
limited the power of the state. The Russian Church was derived from the Byzantines, and the Eastern Orthodox Church was Caesar-Papist, meaning that the head of the church was appointed by the monarch. The Christian church as it came to develop in Russia was an institution subservient to the state and continued.
Okay, so we're seeing some really interesting trends. The army controlled by the monarch. The church controlled by the monarch. These were things that weren't really like that when it came to Europe, for example. The army and the church sometimes, but not always, were controlled by the monarch. And Russia, you had not one but two. Those two controlled by the monarch.
Continued to be throughout history.
So that
be it
never turns out to
kings,
be pretty good.
emperors, Communist Party bosses, or today's oligarchs.
Yep.
The completion of the Russian absolutist state occurred in the late 1500s under Tsar Ivan IV. He established a military
Is that
system
Ivan the
with
Terrible?
absolute powers to himself called the Oprichnina, and inflicted a decade-long reign of terror upon the country. Ivan had asked the aristocracy permission for this undertaking, and they had approved, which goes to show how little the Russian aristocracy could do, or even wanted to do, to limit the power of the monarch. Even though Ivan's reign of terror would come at an enormous cost to them. Of the many aristocratic families of Russia, only 9 survived this reign of terror. This state structure of absolute, unrestricted power within the monarch continued after Ivan, including with the establishment of the new Romanov dynasty in 1613. And it is not difficult to see it continuing throughout the history of modern Russia. You can see the slavish capitulation of the Russian aristocracy to
Yeah, for sure. I'm taking requests, but I think I'm gonna end the live stream after this video. But I'll definitely start the next one with Geography Now Liberia, and other video that was recommended by me. The Origin of the Huns.
Ivan's reign
Those
of terror
two
almost
are
reflected
gonna
in
start the next live
capitulation
stream.
of the Soviet Politburo to Stalin's reign of terror. And you can browse through the list of murdered Russian journalists yourself to see that in many ways.
Yeah, it's fucked up because Russia, despite being a part of Europe and the developed world, you could call it, it's one of the most dangerous places to be a journalist. It is insane how power the state has over the media, for example. It seems like Western Europe, European feudalism, and aristocracy set the precedent for a limited power
Russia
of government.
remains a country
True.
in which state power puts the
They set
ruling
that
man
limit for
above the law,
limited
and removes
power.
them from any accountability to the law or the wider
But
citizen.
in Russia,
A mistake often made, though, is to assume that these
It's Russian
developments
culture,
were
yeah.
unavoidable and somehow part of some inner logic of Russian culture itself.
yeah, come
The
on.
city of
That's
Novgorod
not.
continued to prosper and was never conquered by the Mongols. Its institutions developed to have more in common with those of European city-states. It was the gateway for European goods into Russia and Russian goods into Europe, which made it incredibly rich. The Prince of Novgorod may have commanded an army, but he was accountable to the Veche, a parliament of the city that all free men of the city voted for, and which picked a mayor from the city aristocracy.
You can thank
The Veche
communism
and
for
the
that.
mayor had control over taxation,
Yep.
laws, and foreign policy. It even had the power to remove the Prince of Novgorod from power to replace him with another. There was a different Russian political development which evolved to have checks and balances, as well as state accountability and rule of law. But that development ended when Ivan III conquered Novgorod, had its leaders executed, and its merchants and aristocrats deported
Sent
to
into
the
a
deep
gulag.
ranks of central Russia. One can only
Damn.
imagine what modern Russia would look like if the free city of Novgorod had been its founding structure instead of the Tsardom of
It wouldn't be. It would have. Yeah.
Moscow.
The
only
country
other
of
Russian representative
Novgorod.
body was the Zemsky Zabor, a council of aristocrats that gathered to do little more but approve the line of succession to the throne and approve of the Tsar's wars, until Peter the Great even took those powers away from it. Meanwhile, in the rest of Europe, parliamentary assemblies, which in some cases were as old as the Middle Ages, started gaining more and more power from monarchs, establishing parliamentary political institutions and traditions throughout Europe. In Russia, there was no parliamentary institution until the establishment of the Duma in 1906, which had its powers taken from
Yeah. Think about that. No parliament. No form of parliament. Until 1906, and it was removed in 1912. It's fucking insane. Was the Yucatan back then called the Siberia of Mexico? I don't know if back then, but I've heard that term. I've heard that term that the Yucatan Peninsula was sort of the Siberia of Mexico, and they did send a lot of people there because at the time there was no beautiful beaches, but just a bunch of hot jungles.
it by the Tsar again only a few years later. By the 1700s, the Russian state was far more centralized than any of its European counterparts, but far more underdeveloped in economy and bureaucracy.
Way
There
underdeveloped.
were no regional political structures tied in accountability to a central state. Instead, rule of local provinces was handed out by the Tsar in so-called kormlinye, which means feedings. And the name kind of gives away the predatory nature of the political institution itself. Local rulers had no accountability to law either, and no restraints on how much they could exploit the office for personal gain, as long as they managed to appease the centralized government. When you look closer at the previously mentioned list of murdered Russian journalists, you will notice how most are regional reporters in small towns who were investigating the corruption of a local police department or mayor.
Wow, so there weren't a lot. I mean, there were some that were in Moscow, for example. Here I can see two, but most of them, it's interesting to know that they were in small towns. So, it's not Vladimir Putin just, moving its hands to kill all the journalists, but it's actually a result of the small, inefficient government.
Is that this practice of
a lot of corruption
remained in place despite being reformed by Peter the Great.
It's also great to think that Kazakhstan was the whole USSR at one point. I think for a few days, right, or a few hours. It wasn't very long-lived.
The reason
but
for this may be found in that the new system rewarded successful local governors with tax exemptions,
But it is crazy to
thereby
think.
incentivizing the aristocracy to squeeze the peasantry even harder in service of the state and themselves. A legacy of Peter the Great's reforms was that the tax burden of the state was increasingly placed upon the Russian peasantry, while the aristocracy were increasingly exempt.
Ooh.
In modern Russia, you will find an enormous contrast between the wealth of the oligarchs and your average Russian pensioner, whose pension is barely enough to sustain him. In many ways, it has been a common thread throughout Russian history since the 1700s that the burden of securing the state and the ambitions of wealth of its ruler have been dumped upon the Russian peasantry, from the trenches to the gulags to today's pension and social security cuts. An additional aspect of Peter the Great's reforms were the introduction of severe punishments for serfs who left their lands, but also for regional rulers and aristocrats who granted more freedoms to serfs and peasants.
So imagine that, you can't grant freedom to your peasants.
This bound the rulers of Russia on
Bad.
a regional level even closer together to cooperate in their exploitative economic structure and tied them deeper to the centralized state. Everyone was now tied together in this, and nobody could take the risk of stepping out of line. Centuries later, those Communist Party members who may have disagreed with the
Oh, this is the photo. This guy's gonna be erased from the photo.
Politburo on something found themselves shot.
Yep.
And today, those oligarchs who step out of line with the central government find themselves dispossessed, jailed, or murdered. Russian absolutism was founded on an alliance between the central ruler of the state and the rulers of the various subdivisions of the state to enrich themselves at the expense of everyone else. It is why Russia never had a bourgeoisie, a small business Mittelstand, commercial trader class, or any resemblance of equality before the law and public accountability. As the historian John Dillon described it,
"The Russian government, more than any other, was a government of men and not of laws."
And that aspect of Russian absolutism is what
Remains.
makes it so unique. To show why, we can compare Russia to another absolutist state, China, which also underwent a century-long political development that resulted in a powerful, centralized state institution with absolute power.
I find it weird how Australia is considered its own continent, but not Russia, even though it's the largest country ever. It's pretty large. I mean, it's fucking huge. It's not even close, Russia, to like the second. But I think, Australia, the whole ocean, and I think that's what... But it's insane to think about Russia's size.
Power and a lack of public accountability. But you will find a very big difference.
How do you even erase someone from a video before digital photos? Honestly, I wish I had an answer to that, because I'm sure it's very interesting, but I have no idea. I had the same question.
Between the two.
How they
Chinese
erased that guy from a
absolutism
photo?
was built on a foundation of meritocracy in competition with patrimonialism. Chinese rulers continuously found themselves in positions of having to abide by some standards of accountability to the state bureaucracy.
Shit,
China
I
has,
didn't
just
even
as
wear my
Russia, gone through
glasses.
periods of incredible abuse of power, from the Empress Wu to the Great Leap Forward to the Cultural Revolution. But all these periods resulted in reshuffling and restructuring of the political leadership to not repeat mistakes. Mao Zedong had to step down from the Politburo after his great leap forward caused the Great Chinese Famine, and only regained political power through a populist coup with the Cultural Revolution. And that populism was something the Chinese state consequently cracked down upon after Mao's death. Just as in Russia, the state is absolute in China. If you wish to protest against a decision by the state or change the course of the state, you have to go through the institutions of the state. And just as in Russia,
has anyone of you seen this movie, the new one of the Kingsman? They touch a lot on the World War I history. I want to watch it, but because of the whole COVID thing, I couldn't go to the theater and watch it. Technically, America is a continent. America is North America is the region. South America is region.
Russia, you will
Depends
find
on how you
use of
define
power
it.
in China, such as local governments that cover up the selling of poisonous baby formula. But the difference in the political structure becomes very clear when you compare abuse of power and corruption. In China, the further you go up in ranks of government, the less corrupt state officials become as a result of the meritocratic state structures. In Russia, the further you go up in the ranks of government,
The more
corrupt
corrupt you become.
state officials become. As there are no systems of accountability, the only measure in restraint is that you can't be corrupt enough as a local Russian politician to start bothering and annoying your superior politician, which is why the government becomes more corrupt the higher the office of the state is. The Russian state is a system of progressively corrupting power.
Yo!
In the next video, we will be comparing China and India, more specifically the millennia-long developments in politics and society that created such different.
Next time we watch this video. I mean, Mexico, for example, don't call USA America, they call us Estados Unidos. Yeah, that's true, but if you look at a definition of a continent, I think it goes something like a large piece of land divided by a body of water, right? And when you look at that definition, the Panama Canal separates North America from South America. So you could make the argument that the whole America's argument is actually correct, and like North America and South America are correct terms to be used. But yeah, in Mexico, nobody calls the US America, which I think it's dumb. I think a lot of people take it way too seriously. A lot of people in Mexico are like, yo, America, like we're all Americans because we live in the continent of America. I just think it's stupid, bro. Like, I think it's dumb. I think it's a dumb argument to be made. You know, what do you guys think about that? The whole America's argument. I wanted to play some GeoGuessr, but I'm gonna leave that for the next stream. And for the next stream, we're gonna watch a few videos that were recommended this stream. I'm gonna save them on my notes, and